أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا ومن يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم: الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. First and foremost, I would like to greet each and every single one of you with the greatest greeting known to mankind. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The topic that I have for today's khutbah is rather a very broad topic, and that is the life of this world, the life of the dunya. Inshallah, like I said, it's a very broad topic, so let's see where that takes us, inshallah. The transient way of this world, how we pass through it, how we live through it, what it gives to us, what it takes away from us, of course we know is all up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. During the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, he narrates that when they used to go and search for the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, when they used to go and look for the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the first place they would go to would be the masjid. And if they could not find him in the masjid, the next place they would go to, Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, he says, ذَهَبْنَا إِلَى الْبَقِيرِ. They would go to the graveyard. And if he was not in the graveyard, then they would go to the marketplace. And the order in and of itself is rather very interesting. You would see that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would be pondering in the graveyard rather than pondering in the marketplace, rather than roaming around in the marketplace. But if you go and take a look at the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he always told us to remind ourselves about death, to remind ourselves about the destroyer of pleasure. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, if you take a look back at his life, he lost all of his sons at a very young age. They all passed away when they were just mere children, not even that old yet. He lost all of his daughters before he had passed away himself, except for one, which was Fatima radiallahu anha. May Allah be pleased with her. He lost his wife and his uncle, who was his core piece, who was his rock that he could go back to anytime life was getting difficult. He lost his wife and his uncle only a little while between each other. On top of that, he never met his father. He lost his mother at the age of 6 or 7, depending on narrations, but regardless, at a very, very young age. Every single person that was close to him, he lost before he left this world. Now Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, when you think of a man that goes through all these things, you would imagine someone to be very depressed, very upset, living a very difficult life, not happy often. But Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the Sahabi radiallahu anhuma, they narrate, you would not find him sulking in a corner. You would not find that he was depressed or upset or sad. You would find that he was happy. Every time he would meet someone, he would greet them with a smile. Every time that he would meet someone, he would give them the utmost attention that they deserve. The way he treated his family, he cared for them. He lost all the things he lost, but on top of that, at the end of the day, at the very end of every single day, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam focused on the things that he had. The Sahabi radiallahu anhum and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the narration says that you would find them to be as alive as possible. You wouldn't find them to be upset. You wouldn't find them to be sad. They could sit around with each other, hang out, chill around. They could chill with each other. They were as alive as humanly possible. They had their own enjoyment. They would share poetry. Back in the day, that was something that was very common. That's something that they would do for fun. They would share poetry with one another. They were as alive as you could imagine someone to be. Now, in regard to the dunya, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, "Ad-dunya sijnul mu'min wa jannatul kafir." That the dunya is a prison for the believer and a jannah for the disbeliever, for the non-believer. And this hadith, oftentimes it's not understood the proper way. When we read this hadith without learning anything behind it, when we think that this world is supposed to be a prison for one another, for us, what would you imagine? Obviously, the first thing that comes to my mind is actually imagining someone that's in an actual prison cell. That you have nothing. Your resources have been taken away from you. You have no one to support you. You have no one around you. You're just locked up in a cell. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a worth for this dunya. And what is that worth? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, لو كانت الدنيا تعدين وعند الله جناح بعوضة. That if the world had any sort of value to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that if the world had any worth to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like I said, He doesn't have any worth for this world. The worth, not even janaha ba'udah. Translating this, it means the wing of a mosquito. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not even value this world to be that as the weight of the wing of a mosquito. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he emphasized this oftentimes throughout our lives. But what does this mean? When you care about something, obviously you would go and try to protect it. You would try to go and take care of it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, He has no worth for this dunya. It's just a testing place. That if there was some sort of worth to this world, then why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even allow the biggest non-disbeliever, the one that is most vocal against Him, to take even a sip of water from this world? In the same language, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that on the day of judgment, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, a person will come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for their judgment. And this person will be very big and mighty in a way, in an aspect of their tyranny, in their arrogance, in their pride. So in a physical sense, they can be very big and mighty. But also in a metaphorical aspect, they can have a big head. They can be very arrogant. They can have the greatest of pride. They can have very high levels of takabbur, very high levels of pride. And on that day, on the day of judgment, as he is there in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will weigh him. Because on the day of judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not only weigh our deeds, but in fact Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will also weigh us. He will weigh us for our iman. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam emphasizes janaha ba'udah, that this person, they will not even be equal to the weight of the wing of a mosquito. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْظُرُ إِلَى صُوَرِكُمْ I'm sorry, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنْظُرُ إِلَى صُوَرِكُمْ وَأَمْوَالِكُمْ وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ وَأَعْمَالِكُمْ. That verily Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at your appearance and your wealth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at our appearance and our wealth, what is on the outside. But rather He looks at وَلَكِنْ يَنْظُرُ إِلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ وَأَعْمَالِكُمْ. Rather He looks at our hearts and our actions. What is internal? What are our intentions? What is within us? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not look at all those things that we have attained. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not look at all those things that we have obtained in this world. For example, our wealth, our homes, our cars, our jobs. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will look at what is within our hearts, what is within us. Shaykh Mukhtar Mughrawi, he once said something that I thought was very interesting. He said that if you take the human being and you make an incision around the face and you take that skin off, basically taking your face off, each and every single one of us will look exactly the same. As Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said in the hadith, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not look at our appearance and our wealth and what is on the outside, what is external. Rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will look at what is internal, what is within us, what is inside of us. And as Shaykh Mukhtar Mughrawi said, if you take that off, each and every single one of us would look exactly the same and it would not be pleasant. So the first thing that we learn is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already written the value of this dunya. The word dunya, it comes from two root words. Danu or dani, which means the lowest and the humiliated. Now the dunya, it knows its worth in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is nothing. That is why the dunya, it adorns itself. It decorates itself so that it can take us as long as possible, so that it can delude us from the way as long as possible. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala, he said that seeing the value that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has for this world, the believer sees that. The believer sees that and he separates him or herself away from the dunya spiritually. Not in a literal physical sense, but spiritually, before the dunya can get away from the believer, physically. And number three, that there will not be a single creation, there will not be a single creature that will have a moment in his or her life and will see the exact value of this world. Even the most wicked of people, even the worst of disbelievers. Every single person, every single creature, every single animal, every single creation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, there will be some point in his or her life where he or she will see the worth of this dunya. Even the most wicked of disbelievers. Whether that be shaitan or whether that be the greatest Muslim. Every single person will see that worth of this dunya. Now let's just take an example. One of the worst people ever to step foot on this earth was Fir'aun Musa, the Fir'aun from the time of Musa alayhi salam. Musa alayhi salam, we know the story where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala performed the miracle and the sea split. And Bani Israel and Musa alayhi salam, they could go through that middle path and get away. And Fir'aun and his armies, they were following behind. As they were following behind, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused for the sea to come back together. And one of the most painful feelings a person can feel is drowning. Much less imagine dying from drowning. And when Fir'aun was dying, when he was drowning in that sea, the first thing that came to his mind, keep in mind of Fir'aun's life. This is a man that claimed to be God himself. This is a man that had the best house, had the best wealth, had land, had so much property, was ruling the entire land and everything that was beyond it. This was Fir'aun. He was a man that claimed to be God himself. He knew who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was, but at the end his arrogance and his pride got the best of him. And he was one of the worst people to ever step on this earth. As he was drowning, Angel Jibreel one time he came to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam and he said to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam that, Ya Rasulullah, if you could have only seen me at that moment in time, when Fir'aun was drowning in the sea, if you could have only seen me. I was taking the mud from the sea and I was stuffing it into the mouth of Fir'aun. This is Angel Jibreel telling Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam that I was taking the mud from the sea and I was stuffing it in the mouth of Fir'aun. Because Fir'aun, when he was drowning, he said something very interesting. He said that, oh God, I believe in that God that the people of Bani Israel believe in. This was a man that defied, that went against every single source of worship that Musa alayhi salam was trying to spread. And in the end, the only things that, the last words that came out of his mouth was that I go and believe in the people, in the God that Bani Israel, those people believe in. He didn't even have that much in his heart where he could say that, La ilaha illallah, that I worship Allah. He didn't even have that much in him. He said, I go and believe in the God of those people. And Angel Jibreel said that I was afraid that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would forgive someone even like that. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so merciful. This is on a side note. Oftentimes we go and we make mistakes. We make so many mistakes in our lives, of course we know that. But we oftentimes forget that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful. He can forgive anything and everything and whatever He wants. There's nothing that is not forgivable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ar-Rahman and He is Ar-Rahim. He is the merciful, He is the beneficent. Now going back to the topic, Fir'aun, even he realized the worth of this dunya at some point in his life. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'arij, ayah number 11, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يبصرونهم يود المجرم لو يفتدي من عذاب يومئذ ببنيه وصاحبته وأخيه وفصيلته التي تؤويه ومن في الأرض جميعا ثم ينجيه كلا إنها لظى نزاعة للشوى تدعو من أدبر وتولى وجمع فأوعى. صدق الله العظيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ma'arij that on that day, on the day of judgment, a person will come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he will give the world in gold so that he can get himself or herself out of the situation that he or she is caught in. Falling into the bounties of this world, forgetting what is to come afterwards. That this person will give the world in gold. وَصَاحِبَتِهِ وَأَخِيهِ, his wife and his brothers and his sisters and his children, everything that he or she has. He or she will give the world in gold to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just so that he or she can get out of this situation. So everyone will come to a point, and what is too common is that we come to this point too late. As Fir'aun did, he came to this point way too late in his life. The second that he was about to die, his life was about to be taken. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا, and do not forget that which is in this dunya. Pursue the akhirah. Pursue the afterlife, but don't forget this dunya. Of course, in order to attain Jannah, in order to attain the greatest blessing and the greatest ni'mah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have to work your way up. And something that is a very big misconception today, a common misconception today, is that we relate our hardships with anger from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We relate punishment as a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We relate ease. When there's peace in our lives, when there's ease in our lives, we often relate it as goodness and happiness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that virtually Our status in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has nothing to do with our status in the dunya. Where we will be in the afterlife has nothing to do with where we are going to be right now. There are two groups of people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. There is the group that has ease and gratefulness, that is their test. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them bounties, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them abundance, and their test is to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Give shukr to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And on the other side, you have the group of people that are tested constantly. They go through hardship and their test is to be patient. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not test a single soul with something that he or she cannot take. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, each and every single one of us, our slate. And oftentimes this greed within ourselves, there's this greed that is naturally built within human beings. That as long as my slate is clear, that it was so easy when that person was saying it in the khutbah to be patient and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will get you through that hardship. It was so easy when that person pulled me over to the side when I was going through some hard times in my life and they were telling me to be patient. It was so easy when I was reading it in that book. But often, like I said, we have this greed within us. That as long as 6 billion other people are going to hell, as long as the world is burning down, but my slate is clear, my slate is fair. As long as the world is unfair to 6 billion other people, then nothing else matters to me. There's this greed within us. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he was the most tested. If anyone's life was not fair, it was his. He was the greatest creation ever created. In Surah Al-Kahf, we read that every single Friday. And there are a few different stories in that surah. In that surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the story where he punished a man by giving him an extra garden. We never look at it that way. For some of us, ease and gratitude are our tests. And for some of us, patience and hardship are our tests. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Kahf, he tested a man. He punished a man by giving him an extra garden. And on top of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loved a couple by taking away their child. Any person that goes and reads this without trying to understand any of the tafsir of the surah, they would question that. That why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take away their child? And why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give such an arrogant man an extra garden? This is the test that we have been given. And oftentimes, it is more the people that go through patience and hardship that realize what they're going through. Because when you're given ease and gratitude, you don't have to rely on anything or anyone. But the people that go through hardship and patience, they oftentimes will rely on something. They will rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is why Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that there will be more poor people in Jannah, the more fuqara and masakeen. Because why? Because they realize, they understand, they go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like I said, it's a very big misconception today that our status in this world, we often relate it to our status in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we're being punished, we think of it as a test of patience. When we are having some sort of punishment in our lives, we look at it as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being angry with us. When we look at our lives being happy and easy, we look at it as gratefulness and happiness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is not the case. Like I said, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he had the hardest life from any of us. From any creation that was ever created, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was the one creation that had the hardest life. Surah Yusuf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the entire story of Yusuf alayhi salam. Keep in mind, as we all know, Yusuf alayhi salam, he was a prophet. He was Nabiullah. On top of that, as he was Nabiullah, he was the son of Nabiullah. He was the son of the Prophet of Allah. Who was the son of the Prophet of Allah? On top of that, who was the son of the Prophet of Allah? So being prophet was in the lineage of Yusuf alayhi salam. You can't imagine a more blessed lineage than Yusuf alayhi salam. But if you look at Yusuf alayhi salam's life, you go and take a look at it, what do you find? You find that this child was abandoned by his brothers in a well. He was picked up and sold and kidnapped into child slavery. The one that was selling him saw no value in him, so he sold him for a few coins. The one that bought him saw no value in him, so he bought him for just a few coins. SubhanAllah, he was a product of a transaction. But in the eyes of Allah, he's Nabiullah, he is the Prophet of Allah. He's a noble man. Too many times we ask ourselves, we don't understand this hadith properly that I mentioned. الدنيا سجن المؤمن وجنة الكافر. That this dunya is a prison for the believer and a jannah for the non-believer. We always often ask ourselves that why is it that non-believer has it so good? They have no worries in their life. But you go and look at that believer, you go and look at that Muslim, and he or she is going through such a difficult time. But every day they go and stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 5 times a day. They pay their zakah. They fast in the month of Ramadan. But on top of that, they have no resources. They're going through such a difficult life. Let's flip this. Let's flip the scenario. I'm going to throw a curveball at you guys. There's a very famous scholar in history named Al-Hafiz Ibn Hajar Al-Asqalani. Many of us have probably not heard of him. But his explanation of Sahih al-Bukhari is the highest explanation there is. There is no explanation after his. His name was Hafiz Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Now, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, like I said, he's one of the most well-known scholars to ever step foot on this earth. He had status in society. He was the Qadi of Egypt. He was the great judge of Egypt at his time. He had wealth. He had the best of health. He wore the best of clothing. And so one day he was walking through the marketplace and he came across a non-believer. And this non-believer, he was very vocal against Islam. He was very vocal in the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and the belief of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he wasn't just some random non-believer, he was rather very vocal. And this non-believer, he used to sell oil for lamps on the side of the road. And so one day Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he was walking through the marketplace. And he came across this man. And he asked him that, Ya Shaykh, wasn't it your prophet that said, Ad-dunya sijnul mu'min wa jannatul kafir, that this world is a prison for the believer and a jannah for the non-believer? And Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he said, yes, my Prophet ﷺ said that. And so he asked him, so what prison are you living in and what jannah am I living in? I'm selling oil for lamps on the side of the road. At that time, they didn't have electricity. They used to carry around lamps that had a kindle of fire in it. So he said, I'm selling oil for lamps on the side of the road. I'm wearing these shabby clothes, these really bad clothes, ripped up clothes. And you, mashallah, you have status in society. You're a judge of an entire land, of an entire country. On top of that, you're completely rich. You have amazing health. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, on top of that, he was extremely good looking, the narrations say. So you're extremely good looking. So what prison are you living in and what jannah am I living in? And Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he responded back by saying that as for me, that this is my prison. Because compared to what I expect to get from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter, in the afterlife, this will be my prison. As for you, وَجَنَّةُ الْكَافِرِ, that this world is a jannah for the kafir, for the non-believer, I'm afraid that this is as good as it's going to get for you. That this is your jannah. Right then and there, the man, he went and accepted Islam from the hands of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said in a hadith that there will be a person, when Allah loves someone, when Allah loves a person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes that person away from this dunya. in a spiritual sense. Similar to that if someone was suffering from a very high fever, you can't give them a cold glass of water no matter how bad they want it. No matter how bad a person wants the dunya, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes it away from them. Similar to that matter, no matter how bad someone is suffering from an extremely high fever, all they want to do is cool down because they're sweating so much, but they can't have it because it's harmful for them. There's no benefit in it for them. When you have a drug addict, someone that's suffering from addiction to marijuana or cocaine or painkillers, you can't give it to them because it's harmful for them. There's no benefit in it for them. Rather, it's a destruction to themselves. When someone is suffering from a very sore throat, you don't give them cold water because it's only going to make it worse for them, no matter how dry their throat is feeling. No matter how bad they want to soothe their throat, you can't give it to them. So why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give a drug to an addict and our addiction is dunya? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like I said, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no words for this world. But in order to achieve the highest, you need to be the best that you can be. You have to have the best of both worlds. This dunya is a testing place. It's a testing world. You have two groups of people, those that are tested with ease and gratitude and those that are tested with patience and hardship. It is up to us to find out how to get through that. What is our blueprint in order to succeed in this dunya but also attain the highest status in Jannatul Firdaus? So I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we follow in the footsteps of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, who was the most tested. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we follow in the footsteps of all the prophets that came before Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Surely they were tested, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests those who He loves, and every single person has a test, whether that be of hardship or whether that be of ease. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we use these tests to attain Jannatul Firdaus. وأقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المؤمنين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الأمين. أما بعد، فيا معشر المسلمين، أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم: إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما صليت على سيدنا إبراهيم وعلى آل سيدنا إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما باركت على سيدنا إبراهيم وعلى آل سيدنا إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. عباد الله رحمكم الله، إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله تعالى أعلى وأولى وأعز وأتم وأجل وأهم وأكبر.